In the context of the Irish DPC, I think it's been clear that they have been very proactive when it comes to reviewing and trying to protect the processing of children's data. I think that's happened in two ways. One way is through the element of enforcement, and that's the investigations, the decisions, and a couple of very large fines that relate to Instagram and TikTok. But I think a second and very important way is through guidance, and the guidance that has been very detailed. There's been a significant guidance note issued in 2021. There was also specific guidance notes issued to children, and then some guidance notes issued to parents as well, or guardians. And I think all of that is very important. But in the context of the impact that I think that's had, and with apologies for making this sound going back to absolute basics, but a couple of things I think we need to remind ourselves of. And one is that obviously the GDPR does apply to the processing of children's data as it applies to the processing of adults' data. So all of the obligations under the GDPR apply when you're processing children's data, whether that's transparency obligations, legal basis for processing, privacy by design and default, data security, data restrictions on the retention of data, etc. It's also clear that under the GDPR there are some specific references to children which highlight that an enhanced level of protection is required because of the nature of a child and the fact that they are deserving of protection and there is more risk involved in that regard. And so they're the basics. And then you see some of the decisions that the DPC have come out with. And so they've had two particularly large investigations against TikTok and Instagram. And the impact of that has been corrective measures that have been required of both Instagram and TikTok, and also very large fines. So the very large fines are the ones that get all the publicity. So 405 million when it comes to Instagram, 345 million when it comes to TikTok. But as important have been the corrective measures that have been required as well. And so maybe just looking at the Instagram matter, and there's a couple of common themes between the two decisions. The Instagram inquiry concerned the processing of personal data in relation to child users. It focused in particular on the public disclosure of email addresses and phone numbers when children were using the Instagram business account feature. And it also looked at a public by default setting for personal Instagram accounts of children. And a common theme is this issue that there really shouldn't be public by default settings when it comes to children, and there should be very clear information around that. So in the context of the decision, and we know that the initial draft decision of the DPC was subject to challenge, and as a result it was amended at EDPB level, but there was a number of findings of breach. One was Article 5 in relation to fairness and transparency. There was also a finding that there was no legal basis for processing. There was a finding of fault in relation to the lack of transparency and information obligations, that there was privacy by design and by default hadn't been fully complied with, and that there hadn't been a DPIA when there should have been. And then if you look at the TikTok investigation, and that focused on particular platform settings of TikTok, including a public by default setting and a family pairing setting. It looked at age verification as part of the registration process, and it looked at TikTok's transparency obligations. So in that context, there was a fine of 345 million. There was also a reprimand and an order to bring processing into compliance within 3 months. And in the focus of the platform settings, I think there was a negative outcome because of the public by default. There was a negative outcome because of the family pairing feature not being regarded as secure. It appeared to allow adults who are not the parents or guardian of the child to link their account to the child user account. That was regarded as insufficient protections, breach of data minimization, breach of privacy by design and default. The default account settings weren't properly secure as a result. Age verification, I think there was an acknowledgement that this is a challenge, but there was an adverse finding in relation to what they felt was a lack of realisation that people under 13 might actually want to get on to TikTok, and that the DPIA that had been carried out didn't focus on people under 13 as well and the dangers of them getting access to TikTok. And then transparency was a key one as well, insufficient information and information not being concise, transparent and intelligible. And I mention this because as a result there's these common themes. The common themes are transparency is key. Another common theme is privacy by design and by default is extremely important. And a further common theme is Article 6 and your legal basis for processing. In parallel with all of that then, we then have guidance that's issued by the DPC, and it's probably one of the most detailed sets of guidance that's come out from the Irish DPC. Normally the guidance is short and sweet. This guidance is at least 100 pages, and it goes into very significant details about what they call 14 fundamentals. Each of those fundamentals being very important. They overlap with some of the findings in the decisions, such as acknowledging that children need enhanced protection, that in that regard you've got two options. You've got your floor of protection. You can either give everybody the equivalent level of protection, including adults, or if you're going to differentiate between children and adults, you have to have appropriate age verification, that there has to be a clear-cut consent, that you need to know your audience. You need to have information in every instance. Just because a child or the parent consents doesn't mean that they're not deserving of all of the appropriate information. That it has to be child-oriented transparency, so that it's transparency in a way that a child can actually understand. And then there's others, such as let children have their say. And I think it was mentioned that, just because it's a child doesn't mean that the child isn't deserving of appropriate information, doesn't deserve to be able to exercise their rights, particularly if they understand the nature and consequence of what they're doing. And then things like profiling is probably, in general, a no-no. DPIAs are recommended, so not having a DPA is regarded as a bad thing. And that all of this should be baked in by privacy by design and privacy by default. And so what I thought that was interesting was that focuses not just on the social media platforms, because one thing that can be, one can be forgiven for forgetting is that when you're talking about the processing of children's data and the protection of that data, it's not just about the social media platforms, it's about any controller that processes children's data. And in terms of some of the, I suppose, the positives and maybe the challenge, the opportunities and the challenge, I think that the impact of these decisions has been that it's focused people's minds on some risk aspects when it comes to processing children's data. It's not just all about the big fines, it's about the rectification measures as well, which in some respects I'd regard as equally as important. It's very clear that it needs to be very child-focused with clear transparency notices. And I think that actually gives a benefit in the context of deciding what type of notices you want. It might be a benefit not only for your children that you're processing data about, but also the adults, because obviously when we're processing data about adults, we also have obligations to ensure that it's concise, that it's transparent. And I'm not sure we always get that right as controllers. So I think what we learn from making very clear transparency notices for children might equally apply for adults as well. I think we've learned that privacy by design and by default are extremely important. And I think profiling and marketing directly to children are probably things best to be avoided. We've got a particular section in our Irish Data Protection Act which sought to make that a criminal offence. It has never been brought into force. It would take too long to let you all know why it hasn't been brought into force, but I'm more than happy to talk about that over lunch or later on. There's a bit of politics involved in all of that, so there's a bit of a background story. But also I think a challenge, and I don't think we should underestimate the challenge. There is a challenge when it comes to the processing of children's data. There's a challenge depending on the age of the child in terms of how you treat them. There's a challenge to identify outside of information society services when you require the consent of the parent or guardian, or when you require the consent of the child itself, or alternately when you can actually look at an alternative legal basis. And one particular area, because I'm conscious of time and I'm going to be dragged off the stage here, one particular area that we found challenging outside of information society services have been things like data subject access requests. So, you know, the parent looking for data on the child and advocating that being a DSAR. And we found some real challenges around that, particularly when the child in question is about 15 or 16 and you try to gauge the maturity of the child. But in summary, I would say that the benefit of the decisions and the guidance is to focus people's minds on the processing of children's data. It's obviously people are understanding that they can get fined and there's certain things they need to do. It advocates in favour of transparency, etc. So all of that is very positive. But I think there are still challenges there in terms of how do I actually make sure that I comply with this. And I think there are challenges in particular in terms of identifying the circumstances when you require the consent of the parent or the child, depending on their maturity level and depending on their age.